Okay, good morning to everybody. I have the pleasure to moderate this session 2, which is on redistribution between urban and rural areas. And for this session, we'll be having 3 presentations. And I have been asked to have a maximum of interaction going on with questions and answers. And we were introduced to the technology, but we will be, I think, also able to just take live questions to the people who are on the panel. I just introduce myself quickly. I'm Pradeep Itti. I'm at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation, in charge for quality assurance and poverty reduction. And I will ask our 3 speakers to introduce themselves, and then we will go on to discuss more in depth the presentations.
My name is Benfica. I'm the lead economist with the Research and Impact Assessment Division here at IFAD.
My name is Katsushi Imai from University of Manchester. I'm an associate professor in development economics.
I'm Shi Li, professor of economics from Beijing Normal University. I work on the income inequality and poverty in China. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So in this session, we will be discussing urban-rural inequalities and how to go ahead with some recommendations. And we will be having the 3 presentators having 10 minutes each, and then we will open the floor for questions and answers. Rui?
Good morning, everybody. Pleasure to be here. I'll be making the first presentation. I guess some of you have had access to presentations, so I'll be skipping some slides that are quite technical, but it will be useful for those who are interested to actually follow the presentation itself as printed. I'll be talking about the effect of the sectoral composition of economic growth on rural urban poverty. And I'll start by highlighting, and glad you're doing this right after the first section this morning, that the understanding of economic growth, how economic growth actually reduces poverty, is a quite critical issue in promoting inclusive development, which is one of the key things that IFAD does. There's been quite a lot of research on this, and we are glad to have Professor Raghav here in this workshop, because he did actually bring to the table a number of things that actually reflect most that's known in this area. I would just highlight that most of the prior research actually focuses on the role of initial conditions, particularly the role of inequality in influencing future growth, as well as the role of high inequality in actually influencing the prospects for current growth to actually influence poverty reduction over time. The basis for this paper was, the realization that, a lot has been actually researched and is understood, but the issue of the characterization of the channels through which growth reduces poverty is actually some areas that we could contribute to. There are 3 areas of research that we did focus here. The first one is to try to work on trying to understand to what extent the effects of poverty and growth are actually influenced by the disaggregation of the effects of labor productivity growth versus employment expansion, and where employment expansion actually plays a role. It is the result of the process of structural transformation, the movement of people across agriculture and non-agricultural sectors, or is it the simple labor force growth that actually drives the poverty reduction in that growth process? We also are a bit interested about the role of initial conditions and how they actually influence this kind of relationship, the growth-poverty relationship. We look at the levels of the country's economic development as the initial conditions at play, the role of inequality, the role of the dependence of natural resources, and the simple time dimension to that relationship actually takes place. I will jump these formulas here, but fundamentally our modules are going to try to estimate the effects of a disaggregated growth. We start by disaggregating agricultural from non-agricultural growth, and then look within that the role of productivity growth versus employment expansion, and then try to highlight the role of structural transformation versus the role of poverty and employment per se in those regressions. We used a very large data set. This data set is a cross-country panel that was produced for the IFAD Rural Development Report 2016 by a team led by Xiaohua Chen at the World Bank that actually allowed us to have internationally comparable data disaggregated by rural-urban poverty, taking into account the two poverty lines, the $1.25 a day PPP, which is the extreme poverty line, and then the $2 a day PPP 2005 as well. We managed to have about 71 countries from low-income and middle-income groups, with data ranging from the early 1990s to 2013. We start our exercise by actually looking at the decomposition of extreme poverty changes, rural-urban by region. And the top graph that you have there is basically showing the levels of rural-urban poverty and overall poverty in the 6 regions, income regions, from the late 90s to the circa 2010s. And the bottom graph tries to disaggregate to what extent rural poverty, urban poverty, or the rural-urban migration is actually driving reductions in poverty in the different regions. So this follows a great deal to what Professor Ravalion has mentioned in the meeting, that rural-urban migration plays a great role. So we try to look at this. What we find here is that back in the late 1990s, the 3 regions that had the highest levels of poverty were Eastern Asia and the Pacific, South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And the 2 first regions have actually experienced considerable decline in poverty level, both urban and rural, but Sub-Saharan Africa remains with relatively high levels of poverty. In terms of the contributions of rural poverty, urban poverty, or migration to the reduction in overall poverty, we find that in the regions with high initial levels of poverty that indicated before, the reduction observed over this long period has been mostly due to reduction in rural areas. While in the 2 other regions, the Latin American region and the Eastern and Central Europe region, and Central Asia region, reduction in urban poverty have actually dominated the reduction of overall poverty. In all regions except for East Asia and the Pacific and the MENA region, migration plays a relatively small role in poverty reduction. We also, before we get to the econometrics analysis of the relationship between growth and poverty, we'd actually decompose also GDP per capita and try to see what sources of growth actually at play. In this case, again, we show the levels on the top graph and the composition on the bottom graph, and we do find that there's been considerable growth in YAP and SAS, and the Sub-Saharan Africa, just like for the poverty, has also experienced very slow growth rates, and still starting from a very low base and still at very low levels. In terms of the drivers of the growth in those sub-regions, we find that the fast-growing areas have actually experienced growth that has been driven by agricultural poverty reduction, so the YAP and SAS region, while the non-agricultural productivity growth has actually played a relatively more important role in areas with initial low levels. The role of structural transformation, as I mentioned in the beginning, we're also interested in that, but we find that it has played basically a very limited role in each region, so the movements of people from agriculture to non-agriculture. And employment expansion has been very important in regions with very high levels of initial GDP growth. In terms of the econometric results, we estimate what we call the poverty growth semi-elasticities, which are basically the percentage point change in poverty as a result of 1% change in the right-hand side variable, in this case agricultural productivity, non-agricultural productivity, transformation, and employment. And we do find that there is a very strong effect of agricultural productivity on rural poverty reduction. This is statistically significant, it's also large. But when we try to control for initial conditions, we find that countries with relatively lower dependence on natural resources see that effect even stronger. And countries with very high dependence on natural resources see the effects being weakened. In terms of the effects on urban poverty, we find a strong effect of non-agricultural productivity on urban poverty, as you can see here. And we see that that effect is basically not sensitive to initial conditions. So countries with high levels of inequality versus low levels of inequality, different levels of development, and in terms of natural resource endowments, don't see the effects of non-agricultural productivity differentiated on that basis. In terms of structural transformation, we see that it tends to reduce both urban and rural poverty, though in terms of the rural poverty effects, they are very well affected by initial levels. We do measure here, we see the effect of the PI ratio. The PI ratio is definitely is a measure introduced by Bourguignon that is basically the ratio between the poverty line and the income of the per capita income, and basically is inversely related to the level of development. So the higher the PI ratio, the poorer the country. And you see here a strengthening effect for poorer countries in terms of the effect of transformation on rural poverty particularly. We do some sensitivity analysis and see that these results are robust to the moving to the $2 a day poverty line. One thing we try to see here, before we get to the implications of this finding, we try to do some historical contributions analysis, try to see, because the initial one was a global regression, we try to see an attribution analysis in terms of in each region, what are the relative effects of these different components. And then the conclusion we come to are that agricultural productivity growth has contributed relatively little to rural and poverty reduction, actually over time historically, in most regions except for South Asia. We find that non-agricultural productivity growth has contributed significantly to reducing rural and urban poverty, and especially via the overall poverty, especially via urban areas reductions. We also find that, when you look at different regions, that the poverty-reducing effect of structural transformation has been confined to the countries with lower levels of GDP per capita. This is consistent with the regression results as well. And at least for this East Asia and the Pacific region, this effect has been primarily a rural phenomenon. We do find that the growth employment ratio has contributed to poverty reduction in regions with relatively high levels of GDP per capita, which is also consistent with our regression results. And in this case, we single out the LAC region and the MENA region. Finally, in terms of policy implications, generally we think that these results underscore the importance of continuing to invest in agricultural productivity and diversification to foster rural transformation. And this is a process that is, this is a fact that's particularly important in the lesser developed countries, and this is substantiated with our analysis. The second implication here, that agricultural productivity growth has indeed made very little contribution, but one thing we realize that if you look at the sub-regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa, it is not very much that there is a lack of responsiveness, but it's more a fact that there hasn't been much productivity growth in that particular sub-region. So this is really an important finding with some important implications as well to strengthen the conclusion one. And the third one is that results reinforce the need to sustain agricultural productivity growth in urban areas to consolidate poverty reduction achievements more broadly. So this speaks to the fact that linkages between rural and urban areas will be important. So sustaining urban poverty reduction will be important to also, transmit effects to rural areas. Finally, in our regression, you may recall that we found that the non-agricultural productivity growth was robust to initial conditions. So this sends an important message that the investments that we can make to strengthen non-agricultural productivity can be poverty reducing in a wide range of contexts. So this is an important implication that we see in this analysis. Finally, I would like to emphasize the fact that the composition of growth definitely matters. On one hand, because growth may actually occur in sectors where the poor are not present, may occur in areas where the geographic areas where the poor are not present. So this sends a very important message to the strategies we may be able and should be highlighting in terms of promoting broad-based economic development and poverty reduction in developing countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rui, for going very rapidly through your presentation. I will now invite Imai Katsushi to give his presentation.
So can I?
Sure. This goes forward.
Okay. Sorry. Oh, okay. Thank you very much. So I'll be focusing on rural and urban disparity in the context of Asia. So to outline my presentation after the introduction, I'll be focusing on the findings of three recent papers of mine. One is Imai and Malai, so focusing on the change in income distribution in Asian countries. And the second paper is Imai, Geiher, and Bresciani. This is on the cross-country evidence based on the econometrics. And the third paper is by Imai on the Vietnam, so on detailed decomposition, then I will conclude. So rural-urban disparity tends to be influenced by many factors. It's obvious that each region has got different growth rate, which will be influenced by differential labor productivity, factor endowments, or infrastructure. So related to the first point, if you look at the cross-country evidence, the degree of urbanization, development of small towns and cities, and the degree of modernization of rural areas broadly defined tends to be different and diverse across countries. Here, the rural non-farm sector plays an important role. And thirdly, particularly in more recent years, the degree of rural and urban interactions have become important. This is related to the literature on structural or urban transformation, like high-value change. Here, the rural to urban migration or remittances would play an important role. But if we do the cross-country type of exercises, we tend to face the data limitations. So because this aggregated data between rural and urban areas is scarce, so we use World Bank data to be supplemented by the SKD IFAD data to do the cross-country exercises, and this will be supplemented by the household data in Vietnam. Okay. So here, this is rural-urban disparity in terms of mean household income. So if you look at the data from 1990 to 2012, disparity has expanded over time. This is China. So this is due to the faster growth in urban areas in China. But on the other hand, the disparity, rural and urban disparity has been relatively stable in case of India. So we argue in the paper, if we discuss the urban and rural disparity, the agricultural wage rate, in terms of real daily wage rate, played an important role. Particularly in China, it has seen steep, fast growth. Right? And if you look at the Gini coefficient, okay, so in China, here the national Gini in China is larger than rural Gini or urban Gini, which would imply the high disparity between the rural and urban areas over the years. And as Professor Lavarian suggested, China is characterized by high rural inequality, where in India, urban inequality is higher than rural inequality. Okay. So if you look at the Gini coefficient, apart from India and China, there are a few countries like Indonesia and Vietnam, which has seen the increase in Gini over the years, right? So the thing I didn't mention here is that in India, number point 2, rural poverty is still a problem. So 27% is still under the $1.9 a day. So in the paper, we summarize the evidence of increase in agricultural wages. So let me move on to the cross-country evidence. So based on Imai, Kaya, and Bresciani, 2018. We focus on the agricultural productivity gap, which is defined as the gap between the agricultural productivity between the agricultural sector, labor productivity between the agricultural sector and non-agricultural sector, which was defined by Gini et al. 2013. As you can see, so many countries have seen the increase in the agricultural labor productivity gap, like India, and also looking at China, right? So productivity gap has increased. In the Philippines, the gap has become relatively stable. Okay. So what we did in the paper was to estimate the effect of agricultural productivity gap on rural poverty, urban poverty, and national Gini coefficient. As you can see here, the labor productivity gap is instrumented by mining sector share, as well as the product diversity index to treat the endogeneity problem. But here, what we found that as the gap increases, rural poverty tends to decrease, particularly as a lower level of threshold. And so the urban poverty tends to be reduced as a higher level of threshold. Okay, and national Gini tends to be increased as the gap increases. So in a separate exercises, we looked at the effects of non-agricultural growth and agricultural growth on rural Gini. So consistent with the literature, the agricultural growth has got the effect on reducing the rural Gini inequality measure in the rural areas. Right, so I'll skip this one. So, and thirdly, I will briefly summarize my paper on Vietnam. So what we did was to apply the unconditional quantile decomposition method to take account of the effect of each factor on the entire distribution. This is so some sort of extension of Oaxaca and Blinder type of decomposition. We use a VHSS data from 2008 to 2012. So because time is limited, I just focus on the key results in 2010. Here, so what we found is that, so this is not shown in this slide, but so rural and urban disparity in terms of expenditure as a household level has reduced from 2008 to 2012 in Vietnam. But here the disparity is seen as a relatively higher percentile, like a median, the 90% percentile. So what we did in the paper was to analyze why, looking at the composition effect in terms of difference in the characteristics and the structural effects basically returns to the characteristic. Main finding here is that the access to basic education is beneficial to the 10th percentile as a median. So that means if the people have more access to basic education in the rural areas, the rural and urban disparity has tend to be reduced. Higher education has the opposite effect. So access to higher education tends to increase the disparity. So we have also found that the remittances have a role in reducing the disparity, both from the composition effect and the structural effect. Okay, right. Just to move on to the conclusion, policy implication. We have seen the rural-urban disparity increase in China, but stable in India. So the so-called agricultural productivity gap has increased over the years, but the gap reduced rural and urban poverty, as well as national inequality. And agricultural growth reduces rural Gini, and the rural-urban disparity has fallen in Vietnam. We have found that education, particularly basic education, and access to remittances in rural areas will reduce the rural and urban gap in Vietnam. So briefly, the policies that increase agriculture widen productivity, so directly and indirectly, and those that would facilitate rural household access to education remittances is important in reducing the rural and urban disparity. And also, policies need to promote cross-sectorial interactions in terms of rural, urban, and agriculture and non-agricultural sectors. And policy need to address within rural and within urban inequality as well as rural-urban disparity. We have found agricultural growth reduces the rural Gini. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now I will invite the third speaker, Shi Li, to present his paper.
Okay, good morning. Thank IFAD for inviting me to the workshop. It's really my pleasure. Okay, I will talk about decline income gap between rural and urban China. So, what is
This one.
this one? Okay. No. The background is that inequality in China began to rise in the 1980s, and by the 2000s, around 2008, income equality reached to very high the levels in China, by comparing to other the countries in the world. However, the official estimate of the Gini coefficient in China as a whole indicated income inequality tend to be declined after 2007. So this figure indicated the long-term changes in the income equality in terms of Gini coefficient in China, indeed. The estimate of the Gini coefficient for the period between 1981 to 2001 come from study of the Martin Ravinin and Xiaohua Chen. They use the data, the group data from NBS, the National Bureau of Statistics. And after 2003, the NBS published the Gini, you see, for every year. So this curve indicated, you see, after 2007, income equality declines slightly. So that means, of course, there are a lot of debate on is reliable or not. Yeah. Anyway, that is, I think, is very important background. So my project also collects the household data. We have conducted household survey in 1988 and 1995 and 2002 and 2007 and 2013, the 5 rounds of the national household surveys. Also, we compare, you see, the Gini coefficient estimate with the data we collected in the last 2 rounds. So that means we use the different definition of income. Some is same as NBS used. Some are different from NBS. It's more international standards. So using the data from our surveys is also indicated, you see, income equality in China as a whole, the decline, you see, that will depend on how large the decline depend on what kinds of income definition used, indeed. So when we do some decomposition, try to break down the total income equality in China as a whole into the, you say, between urban and rural area, and within urban and rural areas. You see, then we found that the decline in income equality in China as a whole is largely due to the falling, the income gap between rural and the urban area, indeed. So that means if you look at, you see, income ratio of urban household to rural household after 2007, you will find that the decline is significant indeed. Yeah. So then we will try to ask questions. Has rural and income equality in China declined, and how much it is? Yeah, what is the important fact? What is contributed to this decline, if it is? Also, do the redistributive, the policy really contribute to the decline in something? That is our research questions we want to ask. So first, just look at the income gap between rural and urban China. You see, if you look at official data, it's quite clear. Income ratio between urban to rural area is a decline after 2008, significantly indeed. Also, if you use our data set, that we call the CHIPS, China Household Income Project, CHIPS data, you will find, you see, the income gap between rural and urban China declined over time, increased over time till the 2007. After that, the gap declined indeed, and the significant decline, you see, between 2007 and 2013 indeed. So also we try to, you see, decomposite, you see, national income equality into within and between urban and rural areas, something like that. If you compare result from using the data in 2007 and that from 2013, you will find, you see, between urban and rural income equality, really the contribution to the total inequality decline indeed. So what is important explanations for the narrowing of the urban and rural income gap in China? A simple answer is that it's a more rapid growth in the rural income than in urban income. If you calculate, you see, annual income growth, you see, for rural and urban household between 2002 and 2007, and between 2007 and 2013, you will find, you see, in the first period before the 2007, urban household had a faster income growth than rural. But you see, in the 2007 and 2013, the rural people have fast income growth, I think. What is, okay. So when you look at income components, you will find, you see, for rural people, you see, their wage income increase very fast indeed. That means the wage income increase largely due to the rural migration. The rural migrants move into the urban areas, get employed, and live in urban areas. So that is the number of rural urban migrants works you see, since 2001, you see. The number increased indeed. Nowadays, around 200 million of the rural migrants live in urban areas. It's quite a large number of migrants. Also, if you look at the wage growth of the rural migrants' work in China, you will find the wage growth was very fast indeed, particularly since 2009. You see, in 2010, 2011, the wage growth is around 15% indeed. It's a very fast growth indeed. Even in 2013, it's around 15%, 6% indeed. That means rural migrants send more and more money, remittance, back to their household in rural areas. That is contribute the fast income growth of the rural household. Also, I think some public policy is really, really important for the fast income growth of rural household and for narrowing income gap between rural and urban areas, you see. Since 2003, the government issues a number of rural policies, indeed. For examples, you see agriculture tax exemptions. That means from 2006, the rural household will never pay the tax again to the government. Also accept school fees for the students in the compulsory education in rural areas. Also another DBOR program implemented in both rural and urban areas. DBOR, that means Minimum Income Guarantee Program, that is from 2007, indeed. You see, before 2007, only the urban household were entitled to the DBOR program. So also agriculture subsidy to rural household, indeed. That is, in last 10 years, the subsidy increased over time, indeed. Also, the hukou reform and the rural migration, I just mentioned that. Yes. So besides this, you see, public policy, also some, you see, the new social security system were implemented in rural areas, like a new rural medical care scheme and the new rural pension scheme. That means all the people aged over 60 in rural area can receive some pensions from the government. And pension level is quite lower, but it's more than nothing indeed. Also, some increasing support for some anti-poverty program. In recent years, the central government put a lot of resources in the targeting the poor rural peoples in poor area, indeed. So by using the data from our service, we try to calculate, you see, the transfer income in the rural household and try to see their contribution to the, you see, income equality in rural area, indeed. So we found that, you see, share of the transfer income in the rural household income increased very rapidly indeed. You see, from less 8% in 2007 to the 15% in 2013. The transfer income, some come from the government, some come from remittance, indeed. So when even the share of the transfer income increased, you see, but its contribution to the total inequality in rural areas did not change at all. That means transfer income become more equally distributed among the household. So when we look at the poverty reductions in rural China, indeed, So that's the third line indicated the poverty reductions over time, which is based on the difference poverty line used by Chinese government. You see. Before 2000, the government used quite a lower poverty line, but and from 2000 to 2010, they use update the poverty line. From 2010, update the poverty line again. But whatever the poverty line use, you will find the poverty reductions in rural areas is quite significant indeed. That means and more rural people, you see, poor people get out of poverty. That is, also contribute to, you see, income growth in the rural area. So that is, let me come to conclusions. Something. That means use the cheapest data estimate confirm the decline between rural and urban China's in the income inequality, and the decline is largely due to rural and urban migrations. Something like that. The fast income growth of rural household, indeed. You see. Also, policy is also very important, I think. That is, pro-rural development policy also play a very important role in the reducing urban-rural income gap in China. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. In my agency, we have been also thinking about what we should be doing to address inequalities and poverty in future. And we have, and that will be my first question to the three of you to keep the ball rolling. In 20 to 30 years from now, there will be more poor people living in urban than in rural areas. And growing urbanization is accompanied by increase of poverty and inequalities, as well as environmental challenges in urban contexts. Rural poverty indicators tend to fall more rapidly in countries with higher rates of urban population. And poverty reduction, including in the surrounding rural areas, is greater in countries where smaller urban centers account for a larger share of urbanization. And this echoes one of the conclusions also of Martin Ravellion's presentation. Mm-hmm. Hence, policies should try to steer economic growth towards smaller urban settlements and to include urban-rural linkages in development strategies. And finally, inclusive urbanization offers a big leverage to fight national poverty, to contribute to a country's sustainable development, and can, through rural-urban linkages, be well combined with support to rural areas. And so functional territorial areas covering connected urban, peri-urban, and rural areas, and fostering rural-urban linkages with a specific focus on smaller and medium-sized cities is to be emphasized. So I would like to ask you if this how does this resonate in relation to the work that you have been carrying? And then we'll open the floor for questions from the participants. Rui?
Yeah, we'll try to be brief on this one. I think you really did touch on some critical areas that some researchers actually have been investigating on, and where part of our research actually also does touch on the issue of rural-urban linkages and the role of small towns. Most of our research does still indicate that investing in agricultural productivity and the growth of rural areas is critical to a great extent because in many of these countries, in this transition stage, rural population is still quite predominant. But one has to acknowledge that as a result of some of the findings we had, that overall poverty reduction in some countries is driven by rural poverty reduction, but in others, in a relatively more advanced stage where urbanization reached a reasonable high stage, urban poverty is driving those overall drops. So the question here is, we really need to look at the specific circumstances of each of those countries, but definitely have some kind of holistic approach to this. Some countries have relatively high levels of agricultural productivity, relatively high level of urbanization. Poverty reduction is occurring in urban areas. The issue here is to make that kind of poverty reduction sustainable in the first place, to ensure that people migrating from rural to urban areas, that are going to actually make urban population as large as you did mention, are ready to face the new challenges. Technology is evolving. The investments in education will be quite critical in that context. So we really need to think early about the future consequences of urbanization, so that we can minimize the likelihoods that inequality actually does rise in urban areas in this process. The linkages in the small towns. This is quite important as well. In addition to investments in productivity in rural areas, it will be important to ensure that employment and facilitation of communication between rural areas and intermediate, medium-sized towns gets actually strengthened, because this can actually help both the growth of those small towns as well as through backward and forward linkages and also employment linkages, that rural areas don't fall behind in that process. So I would basically agree with you that we really need to target the potential for these linkages and need to acknowledge that if you don't do it now, there will be consequences in the future as a result of increased inequality in urban areas that, there's no question the world will be a lot more urbanized 30 years from now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
So in 3 papers I focused on in this presentation. So I haven't specifically focused on the role of urbanization, but I just want to make one comment on the role of urbanization and the role of middle-sized towns. So Luke Christiansen at the World Bank and Professor Todo at the Tokyo University had a paper in World Development focusing on the role of urbanization in the small towns. But Imai Chen and Professor Raghav Kaya had developed a critique, and we shows that using the more recent data, so actually the role of rural development rather than urbanization of small towns had more impact on poverty reduction. But this is a statistical exercise. But my point is that I agree that the interactions between the rural areas and the urban areas is important, and also interactions between the agriculture and non-agricultural sectors is important. But to address particularly the rural poverty and rural inequality, we should focus more on agricultural development as well as rural development. So otherwise, it's quite tricky just to focus on urbanization and the development of rural towns, because there will be certainly the people, like marginalized people, who may be left out of the process of urbanization. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think that is important for the developing countries to have, integration of the rural and urban area indeed. Particularly for China, if you look at the history of the China in the past 30 years, 40 years, you will find, in 80s, a lot of rural migrants were restricted to stay in the rural area. They are not allowed to move to the urban area, indeed. So that's why the gap between rural and urban area becomes larger and larger, indeed. So in the last 10 years, you see rural migrants allowed to move to urban areas, also treated much better than before, indeed. So that means the integration of the development, economic and social development between rural and urban areas is so important indeed. So also I think nowadays when important policy is for China is that even a lot of rural migrants move to urban areas, stay in cities, so they are not treated equally as the urban residents, indeed. So that means even some economic sectors are restricted only for the urban residents, not for rural migrants. Also, some rural migrants could not get access to the public service in the urban area, indeed. So I think that barriers should be removed, indeed. When you come to the middle-sized cities, indeed, now if you look at the movement of rural migrants, you will find rural migrants still like to move to large city, like Beijing, Shanghai. Even this city have a very restricted policy for rural migrants, they still like to come in. So that means the public service is so important for these migrants. You see, that means if you make the middle-sized city attractive for the migrants, that means you should provide better the public service. Also, you should have employment opportunity. So I think that's important. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I open the floor for questions. Yes, maybe just give your name and affiliation.
Raghav Kaya. I have essentially three queries. The first is, the first relates to Rui's presentation. I'm very intrigued that you have agricultural and non-agricultural productivities on the same side of the equation. And the second query is, what's your measure of structural transformation? And I'm asking that because Dr. Imai, myself, and Fabrizio spent a year trying to get it right. And the third query is to the presentation by Professor Shi Lai. I'm very uneasy about your policy discussion because it doesn't quite follow from the decomposition analysis that you presented, which is essentially an accounting exercise.
Yeah, just these two conceptual questions. What we do, basically, we start with the basic equation of GDP growth effects on productivity. And we do decompose the GDP into agriculture and non-agriculture. And then we try to decompose that further, the GDP, agricultural GDP growth and the non-agricultural GDP growth, each in two basic subcomponents, because you can grow as a result of gains in productivity, or you can grow as a result of expanding the use of factors. So in this case, we take labor productivity and employment growth in terms of the values. So this is basically a decomposition of the right-hand side, in this case, the composition of the GDP, that we actually go further beyond the sectoral decomposition to get into the decomposition of productivity versus factor expansion. In terms of and then in this process, because we are having in the same equation agriculture and non-agriculture, we take the definition of, through some transformations, we take the definition, the standard definition we also used in the IFAD Rural Development Report 2016, which is the share of non-agriculture in GDP, basically, and the share of non-agriculture employment in total employment. So in this case, it's in total employment. So the movements, so that share grows as people move from agriculture to non-agriculture. So that's what we call structural transformation. So the economy is moving from an economy more dominated by agriculture to an economy more dominated by non-agriculture. The thing here is that, this can happen, but the effect will only be positive for poverty reduction, generally if the productivity non-agricultural sector is actually better. Otherwise, people will move and you not see the effect of rural transformation. So that's why we definitely separate the two so that we can actually assess the differentiated effects of productivity versus transformation and factor expansion. So this is basically that. Thank you.
Thank you for your questions. I just list the number of policies which contribute directly or indirectly to reducing the income equality between urban and urban China. That have some policy have some effects indeed, but we did some exercise, try to look at each how large contribution of each policy to reducing the income equality within rural area, income equality between rural and urban area. Like some policy like DBAO, that means which reflect the income, the subsidies, grant the household received from the government. In the survey we have such income components. Also we have the pension, or we have some subsidy, something like that. Just look at each these items. Their distributions and their shares of in the total income household income. Then try to make a calculation of their contribution to that. I did not show in my slides, but we have several papers focused on that.
Thank you very much. Other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. My name is Florence Egal. I'm presently working on an initiative that is led by UN Habitat, but IFAD is also involved, and that's David Sutty. The idea is to develop key guiding principles for urban-rural linkages. And so what you said before was music to my ears. So I'm learning a lot in that conference. If I can provide any additional information, I will try to relay to the team that's actually leading this. Because we all believe that unless we get territorial development, we are never going to get Agenda 2030 and sustainable development. We really need that integration. Thank you very much.
Other comments or yes?
Therefore, the question is then how to transfer that newfound wealth to the rural population, which productivity remains relatively stable over the history of human being. And from that viewpoint, I see two big paths for this. One is labor migration, meaning the city as a workforce, absorbing the excess labor of, from the agriculture area. And the other is the city as a market, meaning the cities is absorbing a much higher value, the agricultural products in particular, putting a little bit aside the issue of a non-farm economy in the rural areas. So ideally, economists tell us that this should happen with a price adjustment, right? Because you have city people who should buy up more agricultural products at a higher price, and then the price will also be transmitted. How do you think this is happening? Not only rural area as a supplier of the labor force, but as a producer of the products that goes up the value ladder, because I still see in many countries the food agriculture price is quite suppressed as compared to, let's say, other products. Now you have cheap shirts and so on, thanks to also China, but rural people, if you look at it not only in absolute terms, but in the real terms with the relative price, should gain a better price from their labor as compared to urban resident, in a way that at the end we wanted to see the one day work of agriculture is the same as is as productive as one day work in the factory or one day work in the office. So, how do you see the role of this price adjustment in the market?
Thank you very much. Who would like to answer?
So it's a difficult question. So in terms of the question of transferring the wealth from urban areas to rural people, so my point is that it's not an automatic process. So coming back to my presentation, I have shown in one of the slides detailed decomposition of rural and urban expenditure for Vietnam. And for instance, my research show that remittances play an important role, particularly at the medium level, at the 90s percentile level. But there's remittances is important, but there's also the policies on the remittances, and so the regulations of financial market in general is quite different. So in the countries, so according to which country you are focusing on, and so even for the Vietnam, so it appears that so remittances did not benefit to the lower percentile people. So, but this would, for instance, facilitate. I mean, the migrations as well as the remittances certainly would facilitate the wealth transfer. So, looking at the data, would you like to comment?
No, I'll just emphasize a few more issues in this process. One is that what you highlighted about the role of urban areas in terms of the demand for food that rural areas could potentially supply. It's also true that there's been a very rapid change in even rural diets and small town diets. So this dynamics is actually way beyond the strict rural urban dynamics. Wages and the ability of rural people to actually benefit from this increasing employment in these other areas. I mean, there's a question of skills. I mean, in many areas, it's not that people who migrate and take advantage of those opportunities. Many people are not ready don't have the right skills. So investing in skills, investing in infrastructure, it's a combination of factors that can actually allow this process to be successful. So, and each country is a case. So it is really, one opportunity that we're all identifying, but what to do exactly in each case has to do a lot with the, particular conditions and circumstances of countries and, the priorities they need to put in place. Just like in our analysis, it was clear that some countries have very, very low levels of agricultural productivity, and if migration occurs and, the non-farm economy is not productive enough, the impact is going to be limited. So this can be a consequence of the lack of investments in ensuring that the labor force is ready and the right investments are done, in the system as a whole. So I think an holistic question rather than just...
Andrea Cornia, University of Florence. I think that, we benefited from Professor Li Shi's presentation about a week ago at the University of Florence. And here in Rome is cheating a little bit, because he didn't say that while total income inequality fell, within urban and within rural rose. And so we are in a way in a sort of a Branco-Milanovian situation, or a Ravalionian world in which absolute relative inequality falls, but within countries, in many cases, it rises. So now, in this case, the countries are the rural and the urban. So this is, at least, is the second best situation. So I don't know if you have your comments. Now, if it increases in rural areas, probably it means that if the main driver are remittances, then it means that remittances are badly distributed, because the volume of remittances is certainly much larger than the government subsidies at the local level. So now we also know that if migration continues through networks, then also the poor will migrate. And so perhaps the future will be brighter. Now, on the broader issues that also raised this morning by Martin, I'm not so sure that I would agree with him that, and with what the panelists said, that liberalization of rural-urban migration is desirable. Well, is desirable in China because there is a very fast rate of capital accumulation in urban areas. But in the many countries that IFAD basically supports, these are dependent subsistence economies with a very low rate of capital accumulation in urban areas. So if you allow migration, basically you move, you allow displacement of poverty from rural areas to urban areas, with one effect which is even more negative, which is the provision of public services like education, transport, water, and so on are far more costly. And in urban areas, I remember in Calcutta 30, 40 years ago, even the people living in very, very, very poor places, they had to pay rent. In rural areas, they don't pay rent. So the post-rent income that is even worse distributed. Okay, let migration prosper in China. And China had this marvelous example of the town and village enterprises, so this intermediate level of migration, 200 million jobs. So that is a two-step migration. And if I'm in Burkina Faso to allow all the people from the north to migrate to Ouagadougou, actually, first of all, it doesn't happen. It happens very little because there is a very low capital accumulation in urban areas. And so the question is, how do we increase the rate of savings in urban areas? I mean, what is it? IFAD is bringing the money. Who's bringing the money? And in this case, the countries themselves, they are either, the individuals themselves are rationally not migrating, or the governments impose restrictions, like in Ethiopia. Otherwise, it would have a decline in rural poverty, but an increase in urban poverty, as I think that one of the panelists said. So the question is, when is it desirable and when is it not? And so my view would be, well, if you have a very large surplus labor in rural areas, like we had in China 30, 40 years ago, and then you have a lot of money, a lot of saving, public savings, public saving, foreign savings, and household saving. But the largest bulk was public saving. So if you're able to squeeze wages and increase surplus and invest it, then in this case, migration may be desirable. But in Ouagadougou, I'm not so sure it's good.
Thank you. Who would like to take?
Answer. It's a difficult question. I agree with you. You say urbanization, migration could be disaster, could be benefit to both rural and urban areas, indeed. So that will depend on, you say, some institution and the policy, something like that. Yes, you see, if you go back to, 40 years ago, you will find a lot of surplus labors in urban areas. That is, the rural people really like to move to urban area, indeed. So that means the wage was depressed. That means enterprise and even government benefit a lot from, cheap labors. But nowadays, the wage increased enormously, indeed. But if you look at the saving rate in China, it's still quite high, indeed. It's quite low, in rural area, because income is quite low. But if you look at the saving rate in urban areas, it's still quite high, indeed. Some come from the household, some come from the government, indeed, because the physical revenue increased is even fast than GDP increase, indeed. That means even a lot of rural migrations is in the process. So may not, the harm economic growth, something like that. Nowadays, of course, yeah, if you look at economic growth rate is slightly lower compared to 10 years ago. But now it's still quite high. The economic growth rate is about 7% indeed, something like that. So I think largely come from, the investment of the government, the local government, indeed. The local government borrow a lot of money from banks. That means their debts increased, indeed. There's some create some risk, financial risk or something like that. So that means, we should remember that is the productivity of the labor also increased, indeed. Some rural migrants, even is staying in the urban areas, their knowledge and their experience, their skills accumulated, indeed. So that means the productivity of the labor increased, indeed. So I think that's the source for economic growth in the future, something like that. Also, you will find is expansion in higher education is so significantly indeed. So that means skill work increased, something like that. I don't know. Yeah, I know your question is so difficult to answer. Yeah. Thank you.
Can I try to answer this difficult question? Very quickly, there's no general presumption in an economy with labour market distortions in urban areas in particular. There's no general presumption that removing restrictions on migration is an unambiguous gain. There may be a second best policy, which is to actually add restrictions on migration given urban labour market distortions. So it's a classic theory of second best problem. That said, if I was advising any kind of development country government to restrict migration into urban areas in response to the distortions that government is supporting implicitly or explicitly on urban labour markets, I'd have to think twice about my credentials as a development economist, because there is an unambiguous gain out of removing both sets of distortions, and that should be the prioritization going forward.
Just one observation of that. I mean, someone once said that, a good policy is one that allows you to maximize outcomes without restricting choices. So I pretty much agree that, barring migration would be quite a tough thing to do. But if migration happens and benefits are not happening for some reason, fixing that reason would be the primary one without necessarily limiting the ability of people to actually move, because people move for so many reasons, and we see impacts on the things we measure. And then, we kind of take our conclusions, but definitely agree with that.
Ask the organizers, when is the move to the other group, because we are not on the schedule anymore since the first session. 11:45, but now it's 12:20. Yeah. But do you know when the next session is supposed to start, or we can continue happily discussing? Pardon? Yeah. Pardon? We need to wrap up. Okay. Thanks. Is there any last question? Yep.
My name is Mustafa Jami. I'm with the Islamic Development Bank. I have a very short question. I'll try to make it very simple. I think we've been focusing on a lot about how do we reduce the gap between rural and urban inequality. We've talked about high rate of migration, urbanization, and all of that. And we know that the world's population is also increasing. What's your take on, in terms of making sure, the food security needs of a growing population is not really left behind? Because I haven't had a lot of evidence why a government would say, okay, I need to go the other direction and focus more on improving on agricultural productivity. Thanks.
In 1 minute, and then the others can also say something. Increasingly, there's been a combination of objectives that countries do have. I mean, in addition to poverty reduction, concerns about economic inequality, the issue of food security and nutritional security is also on the table, including, in the SDGs. And actually, it's true that many countries have reduced poverty significantly in terms of the rate, not necessarily in terms of the numbers of people, particularly those countries with growing populations, and that's generally the case actually in sub-Saharan Africa. But in general, many of those countries actually still have serious problems of stunting, of underweight, of children, and not meeting the food security requirements. So this is definitely a priority. In the context of this discussion, what I would say is that we are talking about all these rural-urban linkages, etc. In the process of investing to maximize those, the idea of maximizing, of minimizing the risk of hunger and food insecurity should always be in the table. Right? So it is a business opportunity, but it as well as government should be aware of the fact that they need to keep on track, the food security of the people so that even productivity levels can be increased and sustained, because that's a risk actually to economic growth itself. Thank you.
Very much. Anybody else wants to add?
I just want to make a quick comment. So I haven't presented in this presentation, but looking at the migration patterns in India, particularly for the seasonal migration. So this has been used as a risk coping strategy for rural people, so a majority of the rural people. But as you mentioned, that so the security is for the people is not necessarily guaranteed, so which should be supported by the policy. And this is particularly relevant to the relatively poor people. But I don't have an answer. But I think that this is certainly an issue for India. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, Katrina, should we close the session now so that the two other sessions can take place before lunch? So thank you very much to the three panelists and to the participants for this lively discussion.